The prison sat on the edge of a forgotten town, its concrete walls rising high against the horizon like a fortress built to keep out more than just criminals. Life inside followed a rigid rhythm. Doors clanged shut, guards shouted orders, and the endless echo of footsteps on polished floors reminded everyone who held the power. Yet within this routine, secrets thrived, and none were more dangerous than the one hidden between the warden and a single inmate. Alexis Monroe, a transgender woman, had been locked away for fraud and theft. But her story was unlike the others who filled the prison cells. She carried herself with quiet confidence, a poise that stood out even in the bleakest moments of confinement. To the other prisoners, she seemed untouchable, not because of strength, but because of an invisible shield of favor that seemed to surround her. It began subtly. At mealtimes, when trays of bland food were pushed down the line, Alexis's portion always seemed a little larger, her desserts untouched by greedy hands. In the laundry room, she received lighter shifts, away from the heat and heavy loads that wore others down. Even the guards who barked orders at everyone else softened their tone when speaking her name. At first, the inmates whispered that Alexis must have found a way to bribe the staff, maybe with money hidden outside. But the truth was stranger than anyone could imagine. The warden, Douglas Price, was known in town as a man of iron discipline. He was middle-aged, clean-cut, and carried himself with the air of someone who believed in law, order, and control. For decades, his name carried respect, and his reputation inside the prison was untouchable. To the inmates, he was a figure of authority, rarely seen up close, always watching from a distance. Yet, despite his stern exterior, Douglas harbored a secret life that began the moment he crossed paths with Alexis. It wasn't love at first sight, but fascination. During a routine inspection, he noticed how Alexis spoke with the kind of dignity rarely seen behind bars. She didn't cower when others did, and she carried herself as if prison walls were temporary obstacles rather than permanent punishment. Something about her pulled him in, a dangerous curiosity that soon turned into late-night thoughts he could not shake. He found excuses to check on her cell, assigning her to duties that required his approval, and slowly, a line that should never have been crossed began to blur. The affair didn't start with dramatic gestures. It was born out of stolen moments in the shadows of the prison halls. A brief touch when no one was watching, a glance held longer than it should have been, a whispered word disguised as an order. Each small act built a bond of secrecy between them. Soon, Alexis began to receive treatment that went far beyond favoritism. Her cell was inspected less often, contraband searches skipped over her bed, and her privileges multiplied in ways that fueled the suspicion of other inmates. They watched carefully, their sharp eyes noticing every detail that confirmed what they already believed, that Alexis had the warden wrapped around her finger. For Douglas, the affair was a balancing act between desire and risk. He told himself it was harmless, that no one would ever know, but the danger was always present. If discovered, he would lose his career, his standing, and perhaps even his freedom. Still, the temptation was stronger than his fear. Every time he walked past Alexis, the prison walls that symbolized his control seemed to close in, reminding him of the fragility of the secret he carried. The whispers grew louder among the prisoners. They noticed the way Alexis avoided punishment, how she slipped through the cracks in a system designed to break people down. In the cafeteria, inmates leaned close to one another, trading theories of what she had on the warden. Some believed it was blackmail, others swore it was romance. No one knew the full truth, but the speculation alone was enough to breed jealousy and resentment. The prison, always tense, became even more dangerous as eyes followed Alexis wherever she went. Douglas Price believed he could maintain control. After all, he ran the prison, and power had always been his shield. But what he didn't realize was that the very walls he trusted to keep secrets safe were the same walls that amplified every whisper. In a place where nothing stayed hidden for long, his forbidden relationship with Alexis was like a ticking clock, each second pulling them closer to disaster. And though neither of them could see it clearly yet, The affair that bound them together was already laying the foundation for betrayal, violence, and the kind of ending that would shock everyone who thought they understood the balance of power inside those walls. The relationship between Alexis and the Warden deepened, though it existed entirely in the shadows. Each day brought new risks, but also new rewards for Alexis. The prison operated like a machine, every movement tracked and scheduled. But within that rigid system, she found cracks she could exploit through the Warden's attention. He provided her with things no inmate should have had: access to better clothing, time away from hostile cellmates, and protection that most prisoners could only dream of. It became obvious that she no longer lived by the same rules as everyone else. Guards looked the other way when she stepped out of line, and when others faced harsh punishment for minor offenses, Alexis seemed untouchable. For the Warden, it was a dangerous tightrope walk. At home, he lived a quiet suburban life, the kind that demanded a spotless image. Inside the prison, however, his decisions were becoming clouded by feelings he didn't dare admit even to himself. He started to justify his actions as kindness, perhaps even rehabilitation. He convinced himself that Alexis needed him, that she was different from the rest. But in the private corners of his mind, he knew he was being driven by desire, not duty. The deeper he became entangled, the harder it was to separate his role as a leader from his weakness as a man. Alexis, meanwhile, began to realize the power she held. She had come into the prison vulnerable, outnumbered, and often targeted, but her connection with the Warden shifted everything. With each favor he granted, her confidence grew. What started as gratitude transformed into leverage. She knew that she could ask for more, and he would find a way to provide it. A transfer to safer housing, an easier job assignment, extra commissary credits. Requests that would have been denied without question for anyone else were granted with quiet efficiency in her case. And each concession bound him tighter to her, because with every secret action he took, the evidence of their affair grew more dangerous. The prison itself was changing too. Inmates who had once ignored Alexis began watching her every move. They noticed the glances exchanged across the cafeteria, the late-night rounds where the Warden lingered a little too long by her cell, the unexplained privileges that kept piling up. Resentment began to brew. In a place where respect and reputation meant survival, the perception that Alexis was favored by the highest authority created enemies she could not see. Whispers moved faster than any official report, and soon, stories of what she might be doing with the Warden spread like wildfire through the blocks. Some believed she was manipulating him. Others claimed she was offering secrets in exchange for favors. But nearly everyone agreed she had a dangerous hold on the man who ran the prison. The Warden tried to silence the rumors with stricter rules and harsher punishments for those who questioned his authority. But the more he tried to cover his tracks, the more obvious it became that he was protecting someone. The guards who had served under him for years began doubting his judgment. Some followed his orders without question, but others quietly filed away their suspicions, knowing that sooner or later, such secrets came to light. Alexis thrived on this shifting balance of power. Where most inmates bowed to the system, she found herself bending it. She was no longer a mere prisoner. She had become the center of a dangerous game, one that involved deception, ambition, and the constant threat of exposure. Yet the higher she climbed within this strange hierarchy, the greater the risk became. She knew that if the truth emerged, there would be no sympathy, no understanding, only punishment. But she also knew that the Warden was too deeply invested to let her fall without pulling him down as well. This fragile connection between them was like glass, beautiful in its reflection of power and desire, but ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. Every favor granted was another crack. Every rumor whispered was another strike against their secrecy. In a world designed to strip people of control, Alexis and the Warden had built their own empire within the prison walls, but it was built on lies and desperation, and though they both pretended they could keep it hidden, the balance they were trying to protect was slipping. Slowly but inevitably, toward collapse. The news of Alexis's denied parole spread through her mind like poison. For months she had convinced herself that her connection with the Warden meant more than stolen moments and whispered promises. She believed it was a path to freedom, that their relationship would eventually pay off with her release. When she learned that the parole board had refused her request, the crushing weight of disappointment turned quickly into rage. To her, this was not simply a setback, it was a betrayal. She had risked her reputation, her safety, and even her future by binding herself to a man who now seemed unwilling to follow through on what she thought he had promised. The prison walls felt tighter than ever. Each clang of the metal gates, each shouted order from the guards, reminded her that she was still trapped. She had once walked the corridors with a sense of power, but now that illusion began to crack. Without freedom, the advantages she enjoyed meant little. The extra food, the lighter work, the protection. None of it mattered compared to the thought of spending years locked away, with no escape. Alexis's mind turned restless, replaying every moment she had spent with the Warden, searching for clues, searching for signs that he had lied all along. On the other side, the Warden felt the pressure mounting. His once careful control over the situation had started slipping. Rumors had grown louder, and he had become more cautious, more distant. Where he once visited Alexis's cell under the cover of darkness, now he avoided her gaze altogether. He reassigned her to shifts that required less supervision, cut back on her special privileges, and spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. It was his attempt to regain control, to put distance between himself and the affair that had begun to unravel. But his coldness only confirmed Alexis's fears. To her he was retreating, abandoning her after everything they had shared. The tension grew unbearable. Each time she saw him walk past without stopping, her anger deepened. She had built her survival in prison on the belief that she had power over him, that he needed her as much as she needed him. Now, stripped of that illusion, Alexis began to plot. Her thoughts were no longer about love or even freedom. They were about retribution. If the Warden was not going to keep his promises, then she would make sure he paid a price for turning his back on her. The prison became her stage for silent preparation. She moved carefully, watching, waiting, studying his routines with the same sharp focus that had once helped her gain his attention. She knew when he walked the halls, when he lingered in the laundry rooms, when the cameras on certain blocks malfunctioned. She noticed which guards were distracted during night shifts, which doors opened with keys left unattended for just a second too long. Every detail mattered now. Other inmates sensed a change in her. Where she had once been calm and composed, there was now a quiet intensity in her movements. She spoke less, kept to herself more, and her eyes carried a sharpness that unsettled even those who had once admired her. No one dared to question her directly, but whispers followed her again, this time darker than before. Some believed she was planning to expose the Warden's secrets. Others thought she might be preparing to turn against him in ways no one could predict. Inside her mind, Alexis nurtured the anger like a flame, feeding it with every memory of betrayal, every glance of rejection. The walls of the prison no longer confined her spirit. Instead, they became the backdrop for the storm she was preparing to unleash. She was determined that if she could not walk free, neither would the man who had chained her hopes and left her to rot behind bars. The Warden, oblivious to the depth of her fury, believed that creating distance would keep him safe. He failed to see that his withdrawal was not dissolving the bond, but transforming it into something far more dangerous. Alexis was no longer a secret lover desperate for freedom. She had become a woman with nothing left to lose, and in prison, nothing was more lethal than someone who had been stripped of hope. The night was quiet, but in prisons, silence always carried a different weight. It was not peace but the kind of stillness that came before something violent or unexpected. Alexis waited in her cell, her mind sharp and restless, her plan etched in detail after weeks of watching and preparing. She had stolen a small shard of sharpened metal from the prison workshop, disguising it carefully and hiding it in places where inspections would not reach. Every step leading to this moment had been carefully calculated, every risk weighed against the outcome she craved. The prison was filled with eyes and ears, but she knew how to move when no one was paying attention, how to slip unnoticed through shadows that swallowed secrets. The warden, as always, conducted his late-night inspection with an air of routine authority. To the other inmates, he appeared in control, a man who demanded respect with the sharp click of his shoes echoing against the concrete floors. But beneath that uniform was the vulnerability only Alexis truly understood. She knew his routes, his habits, the places he lingered. He trusted the rhythm of his nightly rounds, never suspecting that the very patterns he created had become the blueprint for his downfall. When he passed near the laundry room, Alexis was waiting. The cameras on that block had been reported faulty for weeks, and no one had rushed to repair them. It was the perfect blind spot in a prison filled with constant surveillance. She lured him in with the same familiarity that had once bound them together, a gesture, a signal that reminded him of their past secrecy. He followed, perhaps out of old habit, perhaps out of a moment of weakness he could not resist. Inside, the hum of machines masked their presence. The air was heavy with the smell of detergent and damp fabric. Alexis's heart pounded, but her mind was steady. She had rehearsed this in silence countless times, imagining every movement. When the moment came, it was swift and merciless. The shard of metal flashed in her hand, and before the warden could react, she struck with a force fueled by months of anger and betrayal. He staggered, his authority stripped away in an instant. The man who had once held power over her life was reduced to flesh and bone, struggling against the inevitable. Alexis did not hesitate. Each strike was a release of fury, a rejection of the promises he had broken, and the distance he had created. She continued until the fight left his body, until the sound of his breathing stopped echoing against the walls of the laundry room. The aftermath was a chilling stillness. The warden's body lay on the cold floor, blood spreading across the concrete, seeping into the cracks as though the prison itself was swallowing the evidence of his downfall. Alexis stood over him, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, the weapon clutched tight in her hand. There was no triumph, no relief, only the certainty that the line between survival and destruction had been crossed forever. She moved quickly, hiding the weapon where it would not be found immediately, wiping what she could. But in a prison, there was no true escape. Every action left traces, every secret eventually uncovered. Still, she returned to her cell with calm precision, slipping back into the role of a prisoner awaiting lockdown, her face unreadable to anyone who glanced her way. As the night dragged on, the discovery was inevitable. Guards stumbled upon the grisly scene, their shouts breaking the silence that had hung so heavily over the halls. Panic spread as the news traveled. Douglas Price, the warden, was dead. The order of the prison cracked in an instant, chaos threatening to erupt as rumors spread faster than facts. Yet Alexis sat in her cell with an eerie calm, the weight of what she had done pressing against her but not breaking her. The secret affair that had once given her power ended in blood, and though she knew the consequences would be severe, a part of her believed she had taken back control in the only way possible. The warden had betrayed her, abandoned her, and in her mind, justice had been delivered with her own hands. The walls of the prison had always held secrets, but none as dark as the one that now bled through its corridors. What had begun as a forbidden relationship ended in brutal violence, and the echoes of that night would haunt every person who had once whispered about the strange bond between the warden and the inmate he could never resist. By morning, the prison had descended into chaos. Guards raced through the corridors, their radios crackling with frantic voices, as they tried to contain the panic that followed the discovery of the warden's body. His lifeless form had been found sprawled on the laundry room floor, the scene gruesome and shocking. Blood had seeped across the tiles, staining the very space where he had once carried out his rounds of authority. The image of a leader brought down in such a brutal manner rippled through the facility, shaking both staff and inmates, who had always believed he was untouchable. The investigation began immediately. Detectives and forensic teams flooded the prison, combing through every corner for answers. The first clues pointed to the affair that had long been whispered about. Inmate testimonies confirmed suspicions that Alexis had received unusual privileges, far beyond what others could ever expect. Letters exchanged between her and the warden were uncovered, hidden but not well enough to withstand a thorough search. Guards admitted, under pressure, that they had noticed odd patterns in the warden's behavior, but had chosen silence, either out of loyalty or fear. Slowly, the pieces began fitting together, and the shocking truth emerged. The prison's own leader had been entangled in a dangerous relationship with one of the inmates he was sworn to control. The public reacted with outrage and disbelief as the story reached beyond the prison walls. News headlines painted Douglas Price as a man who had destroyed his own legacy through weakness and obsession. For decades, he had been the face of discipline, the symbol of law inside the facility. Now, he was remembered as the warden who crossed a forbidden line and paid with his life. Families of inmates demanded accountability, questioning how such a scandal could have gone unnoticed for so long. Politicians called for inquiries, and the entire correctional system came under scrutiny. For Alexis, the fallout was both inevitable and surreal. She was quickly identified as the prime suspect, though she did not resist when authorities confronted her. She sat silently in her cell, calm and composed, as if she had expected this moment all along. Interrogations revealed little emotion. She neither denied nor confessed outright, but her silence spoke volumes. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the investigators knew they had enough to bring the case to trial. The trial itself became a spectacle. Courtrooms filled with journalists, activists, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the woman at the center of such a scandal. Prosecutors painted her as a manipulative figure who had used seduction and deceit to gain power inside the prison, ultimately turning violent when her ambitions were thwarted. The defense argued she had been exploited, trapped in a toxic relationship with a man who held absolute authority over her. Each side presented its story, but the undeniable fact remained. The warden was dead by her hands, and nothing could undo that night in the laundry room. The jury deliberated, but their decision seemed inevitable. Alexis was convicted of murder, sentenced to life behind bars with no possibility of parole. She returned to prison, not as a favored inmate, but as someone feared and despised, her name etched into the walls of infamy. No longer protected, she became a cautionary tale, a living reminder of how power, secrets, and betrayal could destroy even the most secure of institutions. In the years that followed, the story of Douglas Price and Alexis Monroe lingered like a ghost in the prison system. Guards still whispered about it during late shifts, warning each other of the dangers of crossing boundaries. Inmates passed the tale down like folklore, a grim example of how desire could turn into destruction. The prison itself bore the scars of that night, its reputation forever stained. What had started as a secret affair hidden in shadows ended in a brutal murder that exposed the fragility of power and the darkness that thrives when authority and vulnerability collide. The legacy of the warden was erased, replaced with the memory of his downfall. And Alexis, once a woman seeking freedom, became a symbol of the cost of betrayal, locked away in the very place where her story had begun. The prison walls had always held secrets, but none as unforgettable as the one that claimed both a life and a reputation, leaving behind a chilling reminder that some affairs can never stay hidden.